Good morning, everybody. This is Blake Shalide with the Oregon Department of Energy. This is the public meeting for Building Performance Standards, Rule Review, and Energy Target Development Review. I'm the manager of codes and standards with the Oregon Department of Energy, and we've got our team here of consultants from SBW 2050 and UNRU's here to help facilitate the meeting today. I'll turn it over to that team now to go ahead and get started with some brief introductions and get us into the heart of the meeting. Just as a reminder, this meeting is being recorded, mainly just so we can go back and review it if we need to. And just a quick introduction to WebEx, if you're not familiar with it too, this slide provides kind of a visual depiction of how to mute, unmute yourself. We'll be sharing our slides here. There is a chat that's available. You're certainly welcome to put any comments or questions into the chat. We will have some time for review of the comments and questions that do come in, and we'll try to do our best to answer some live in real time or just throughout the meeting today, but there might be a need to get back to folks if they do have questions that we're just not able to, if we don't have time to respond to today. So next slide, please.
Thank you, Blake.
So
I just want to do. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sepida. I'm with UNRU Solutions, one of your facilitators today. And we have a good 90 minutes with you that we want to cover a lot of content. So we're going to do a very quick intro. Then we are going to give you an overview of the energy use intensity target development process and timeline. We'll cover some background, share some averages and some targets. And between each of these sections, we do have a specific point of time where we want to encourage you to ask your questions or share any feedback you have. But in the meantime, during the whole process, if you have comments, please use the chat, use the raise hand function to raise your hand, and then we will have you unmute and share your feedback with us. Let me quickly share with you the team. You have members from SBW team and 2050 Institute and UNRU Solutions here who've been working on this project, and we're thrilled to share some information with you. With that, I'll pass it to Anna.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Anna Kelly with SBW Consulting. I'm going to start us off today by walking you through building performance standards, key timelines. We're going to go into what the policy is, what it really means, and then we're going to go into some of the definitions for the terms that we're going to be covering in depth today. But when you look at this BPS program timeline, what we're doing today is the very first thing over on the far left in 2024. So you're looking at into the future here, into what this compliance timeline is going to look like. What we're in right now is we are in the data collection and stakeholder facilitation part of the rulemaking. You guys are part of that facilitation group, and we have been previously meeting with with the Regulatory Advisory Committee in Oregon to try to get additional input so that we could develop those targets. By the end of this year, you're going to have a draft rule, or you're going to have a final rule, actually, that will determine what compliance looks like. And then the compliance and the building performance timeline will actually begin. We're going to move on to the next slide, where I'm going to walk you through the target development process, which is what we are doing right now. So like I said, we've been meeting with the RAC, and that committee was established to support the rulemaking. It comprises some building owners, tenants, utilities, other organizations that have experience designing or implementing energy efficiency programs, local government, and other stakeholders that the Oregon Department of Energy thinks might be necessary to have in the room when we're beginning this conversation. So in 717 and 821, we met with those folks where we developed the methodology for how we were going to determine what the targets were going to be. And we started the process of calculating the very initial drafts of what the targets could look like, might look like. What we're going to be presenting to you today is kind of a sneak peek of those draft targets. Over the next couple of weeks, they are going to continue to get finalized and adjusted as additional data comes to light and gets brought in to support the targets. Then next month, after the draft rules have been filed, you're going to have the public comment period opening, and that is when the Department of Energy will start collecting formal feedback on what the public thinks and what other stakeholders think about where the draft rules are. And again, the final rule will get published at the end of the year. Let's move on. Today, though, as I mentioned, we're going to be doing a sneak peek of the potential targets. And also, we want to increase awareness of what the target development process looks like. The process to develop targets is, I'm not going to say complicated, but it does have many steps in it and requires a lot of data. And we want to make sure that there's a broad understanding of what all those steps look like so that you have enough time to get your thoughts together before the public comment period begins in October. So let's move on. This next section, I'm going to be walking you through the building performance standards. We can go on, Sepida, it's okay. So we're going to be talking about the whole background, not only of what building performance standards are, but your bill in Oregon, and then about what those targets actually mean. If you've come to any of the public meetings before, you have seen this slide about the building performance standards key considerations. And what I'm going to be giving here is just a holistic overview. So building performance standards in general are policies that require existing buildings to meet a specific energy or emissions target over time. To implement them, there are kind of 9 things that need to be considered. You have to align the goals with the broader climate objectives. You have to use benchmarking data or some other realistic local data set to create targets that people can comply with. You have to choose which buildings are included, which buildings are excluded. You have to think about exemptions and alternative compliance pathways for that. You have to find a way to provide technical assistance for folks, especially for smaller buildings, establish enforcement mechanisms, and then leverage existing reporting tools to allow people to put in the numbers that they've generated and check for compliance. But the goal is always the same, and that's to drive energy efficiency and emissions reductions while also providing support and flexibility for building owners. Now we're going to move into talking about Oregon specifically. So our building performance standard is House Bill 3409. And this bill divides buildings into 2 groups. We've got Tier 1, which have to comply with the building performance standard, and Tier 2, which will need to conduct energy benchmarking and reporting. The rules are essentially, you can see these 2 buildings, for commercial buildings, hotels and motels, you have to have a greater square footage than 35,000 square feet, excluding parking garage, that is covered spaces. And so if you look in this image, this is like one building, and you can see that gray space on the bottom that says not covered. Imagine that's a parking garage. And then imagine Tier 2 is a type of building or a type of building space that does not need to comply. And then going up into Tier 1, the rest of that building will need to comply with the building performance standards. But looking at the other example, this might be residential, hospitals, dormitories. Part of that will still need to comply with the energy benchmarking and reporting, and the other part in this one is not covered. So those 2 concepts, like BPS compliance versus benchmarking, are pretty important here in Oregon. We're going to go into the next one the next slide to kind of understand the directives and kind of the details that you may want to take away. So HB 3409 has kind of 3 major categories that I would say: the building performance, the average energy use intensity, that's EUI, and the compliance pathways. Looking up on the top at building performance, the directive there is to simply establish performance targets. And then the key detail there is that minimum size, 35,000 square foot or larger. Then there's the average EUI, where the directive is to set targets for those building types. And then the key detail here, and this is what we're going to be talking about today, all day throughout this presentation is that energy use intensity target and what the average is. A very important thing to remember for Oregon specifically is that the average for a building type, that's as low as you can go with a target. So you can't set a target that's going to be lower than that average. So we're going to go into the next steps in just a minute, and I'll walk you through kind of what drives an EUI and what I mean when I say lower than. But before we do that, I do also want to mention the compliance pathways, because although there will be kind of this target that needs to be achieved for building types that can't comply in the standard pathway, there are going to be multiple pathways or alternative ways to demonstrate that your EUI is reducing. Okay, let's go into the next slide and talk about the energy use intensity as a concept. So the idea for energy use intensity, or EUI, you're going to see that acronym the whole time, is it's kind of like a report card for how efficiently a building uses energy. It's like a grade, essentially. You can also think of it like miles per gallon, like you put fuel into your car and you can drive it a certain number of miles before you need to get more. A building is like that too for all of your different end uses. So let's look at the left side of this. We've got the drivers of energy use, and you can see what makes buildings use energy. They've got electricity, and that'll power things like lights, computers, air conditioning. We've got natural gas, which is often used for heating or cooking. And then there are other fuels, less common energy sources. And then that building in the middle shows the different space types. So for this example building, they've got a data center, they've got an office, they've got multifamily, and then they've got a parking garage. That's the gray. And each of these spaces is going to use energy differently, just like how different rooms in your house might use more or less energy, and in your business. You might have a server room at your business, or you know that in your house, some rooms are your big hogs of energy, and we're yelling at our kids to turn the lights off in there, and other rooms aren't like that. A building is like that too. And so when we're building these targets, one of the things we're looking at is all of the different space types, exactly what kind of equipment lives in those, how they use energy, so that we can create targets that are representative. And we expect the EUI to change for a building. So let's go over to the right side of this graph now and take a look at this chart. So what we see here is a bar chart over time, starting in 2018 and ending in 2027. Each of those bars has 3 different colors. The green one represents the electricity consumption in this building. The gray one represents natural gas at this building. And then the dark one represents other fuels. This is not a real building. And we are imagining here that we're trying to achieve that target, which is that dotted line across the bottom that says target. That target right there was what the average was for that building type today, when we figured out what the targets were going to be. But we know this is coming, we need to do upgrades. And so what happens, you can notice that the height of the bars that represents total energy use goes down over time. And that's the goal, right? It's use less energy as time goes on. So the graph is showing 2 important changes that happen in this hypothetical building. The first one is an HVAC improvement. So they fix their heating and cooling system, and their electricity consumption or their gas consumption went way, way down. And then before the target deadline, they also did a lighting retrofit in this one to make their electricity consumption go down. And so just like we're always trying to make our buildings better, we're trying to make our homes better, we're trying to help our kids get better grades in school, what we're seeking here is incremental, gradual improvement towards a target. So by using EUI, not only can the state determine compliance, but building owners can see how well they're doing and find those ways to improve, like upgrading systems. Okay, let's move on to the next section, where I'm going to talk a little bit about how these targets are created. So as I mentioned, each covered building type is going to get their own target. And so we have all these different building types. Here are some examples. We've got healthcare, we've got office, we've got lodging, we've got malls, and there's 37 more building types that we're figuring out the targets for. And the question is, how is energy used at each of these facilities as a standalone, and how do they compare to the other use types? what we have to do is figure out all of the different customizations that need to be made per building type. And we also have to think about time. We're going to be looking at a lot of data from 2018, 2019, and that might be jogging your memory and making you think about 2020 and leading you to ask the question, but what about COVID impacts? We know buildings are different. We are reviewing this data for what we can find in terms of changes from pre and post COVID. So that is going into our assessment here. But we've got all of these buildings. So let's go to the next slide and we're going to talk about how we choose what buildings go in. So we know that in the state of Oregon, there are too many buildings for us to look at everyone individually. So what we have to do is we have to create a representative sample. And we have to assess for each building type, do we have good enough data for all of the office buildings? Do we have good enough data for all of the healthcare buildings? Do we have good enough data for all of the building types that we're interested in? And the best data sources that we use may not have enough, so we'll bring in other data sources. And eventually what we're going to end up with is a representative sample that gives us a subset of that population, but that reflects the overall characteristics. So all the highs will be in there, all the lows will be in there, all the buildings that were built 100 years ago will be in there, the buildings that were built 10 years ago will be in there, trying to create a picture of what is an office building in the state of Oregon. And one of the things that I mentioned is that we have to bring in different kinds of data sources to do this. So we'll use national data sources, we'll use regional data sources. And when you combine data sources, you end up with it's not exactly is error, but you get a plus or a minus on all your numbers that accounts for variability and also accounts for uncertainty. Throughout today's presentation, one of the things you might see on some of the graphs are little black bars that go up and down on the bar charts that we're showing you. That's the error. And you can think of that as like how much more it might be above or how much it might be below the number that you're seeing. And seeing those error bars is actually a good thing because it lets you know what is being accounted for, and it gives you a better sense of what the true number might actually be. I'm going to talk about the data sources a little bit, so let's head into the next slide. And we are almost done with our intro. So I'm just going to talk about these data sources. I'm going to talk about where data comes from and what it has in it, and then we'll move on to some questions. So what we have is we have national data. And the national data typically comes from these big building surveys. One of the ones is called CBEX, and that's the Commercial Buildings Energy Consumption Survey. And this is a national sample survey that's conducted by the U.S. Energy Information Administration. And its job is to collect information on the stock of U.S. commercial buildings. It looks at their energy-related characteristics, their energy consumption, how much they spend on energy, and it should cover all commercial buildings where at least half of the floor space in that building is used for purposes that are not residential, industrial, or agricultural. And this data source gets climate adjusted, so it has weather data in there that we can use. And then we can also drill into more regional data. So we have access to the Commercial Building Stock Assessment. And this is orchestrated by the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, or NEEA, and assesses the characteristics and energy consumption of buildings just in the Northwest region. And this one has on-site visits to try to get a representative sample of buildings and also collects data on building features, their equipment, and their energy consumption. So you can already see how some of this data might represent one building type a little better. Maybe Oregon doesn't have so many of the building types that are represented in the national source. So we have to choose which data set to use. And then we can also bring in local data. We have Oregon specific data and we have city specific data. For many years, these cities have collected benchmarking data. So we can get those physical characteristics, the size of a building, the age of a building, how it's used, what energy equipment it has in it. We can get its costs. And so all of this information together allows us to paint a picture of what the Oregon average is for office buildings and for any of the other covered types. So that's pretty much going to be your introduction to these concepts. Let's go into a couple of questions, and then we'll start talking about the targets that we're developing.
Awesome. Thank you, Anna. So just so everyone knows, there are going to be 3 ways that you can submit questions to us during the presentation. First is a survey. So I've just put a link to that in the chat, and the survey is a great way to provide both questions, comments, and feedback on how we're doing so far. It's totally anonymous. You can choose which questions you want to answer, but that's a great way for us to hear everyone's feedback. And if there are questions that come in through that forum, we're going to find ways to answer those offline and outside of the meeting if we aren't able to get to everything. You can also put your questions and comments into the chat. We'll see those. We can respond to them either live or answer them in the chat. And again, a great way to provide comments, to ask questions throughout the presentation. We're also going to have a limited amount of time for just a handful of questions live if anyone has anything really urgent that they want clarified. So you can raise your hand and I can call on someone and we can have those questions answered. So I am going to see if a couple of questions come in through the chat. We're just going to have a few minutes at each of these pauses. But again, if we don't get to your question right away in the meeting, it will be answered offline. Okay, I see one response in through the survey. Not seeing any raised hands right now. Okay, so Joe, I see your hand. This might be the only question we have for this section, but again, put your comments and things in the chat if there are other things you want clarified. So Joe, I will pass it over to you. I don't know if you need permission to unmute or I'm not able to do anything. I don't know. Oh, there we go. Joe, you should be able to speak.
Thanks. I just got unmuted. I appreciate it. Yeah, so I started my question in the chat, but it's basically how far back. First of all, thanks for this great background on the average, how to build the average EUI for Oregon. How far back does the background data go, and also how recent really is my more important question, specifically considering all of the recent changes we've seen in our daily temperatures and the big swings between winter temperatures and summer temperatures this year and in recent years. So I'm wondering how all of that is also being taken into consideration when building these averages.
Yeah, great question, really important question. Although like the national data set started being collected in 1979, I assure you we are not using the 1979 version of the data set. We've got 2018 and 2019 versions of the big data sets, the national data set and the Northwest specific data set. And then we also have been seeking the more recent benchmarking data and also like specific sector data, for example, schools data sets that are more recent, to fill in those gaps and be able to create those kind of longitudinal adjustments as necessary to account for, yeah, as you said, the climate impacts, as well as changes in occupancy and changes in the way buildings have been run.
Yeah, but thank you so much.
Okay, we're going to pause the questions there for now, but again, if you have a clarifying question, put it in the chat. We can answer that. I do see one question through the survey, so we can get to that one later on, but there's lots of good content to get through, and I actually think the question that was submitted will be answered potentially in our upcoming content. So I'm going to pass it over to Santiago, and we're going to keep things moving.
Thank you, Kirsten. All right, so we're going to go into an overview of our process, how we determine the EUIs. There'll be a discussion of building types, which types we're considering, needing a mean, an average, energy use intensity, and a target, how we develop the Northwest average EUIs, and then what the draft EUIs end up being. So let's move on to look at the process. So our first step is to gather all of these sources of data. It's energy data, square footage data, and other building characteristics. And then we assemble those into a collection that we then perform statistical analysis on. Our second step is to develop an average EUI for the Northwest using 2019 data. So the goal there is to figure out what the baseline EUI is for the Northwest, and then we can do that by combining the regional and national data, depending on what has better statistical significance and what has better regional representation. And then lastly, we develop what are the Oregon average energy use intensities. So here we're tailoring those EUIs, which we calculated in the previous step, to something that's more relevant, specific to Oregon as opposed to the entire Northwest. And we make adjustments for building types based on the other data that we have, and trends which we observe in the 2019 data going forward. We'll note that 2019 was 5 years ago, so there are trends to consider there too. All right, let's move on to building types. Here's a big list of building types. I think the key consideration here is that we have some broad categories, which are education, food sales, food service, healthcare, lodging, mercantile, offices, public assemblies, and so on. Those are broad categories, and then each of these categories have subtypes. So for example, in education, you have colleges and universities, elementary and middle schools, high schools, other classrooms, preschools, etc. The intent here is to develop a EUI target for each of these building types. So these building types are all from the ASHRAE 100 standard, but the end targets that will be available to the public will all be in the Energy Star Portfolio Manager format. There is a direct conversion that happens here, so that's something that'll happen in the final steps. The types that are highlighted in blue are types that we're recommending dropping, or rather not calculating a specific target for. These have different reasons behind them. Some of them are that the description of the subtype is rather vague. What is another office anyway? And then, of course, some of these are actually better represented by blended targets. For example, a mercantile building, which is a shopping strip shopping mall, could actually be like a combination of things like a restaurant and regular retail. So that's a little bit about building types that we're developing EUIs for. One of the key steps here when we're looking at national data is to make climate data representative EUIs for each of these buildings. So for example, we have a lab building in San Antonio, which has an EUI, which we made up, of 115. And ASHRAE has a method that allows the conversion of the EUI of this building to be representative in a different climate. So that lab building in San Antonio would actually have a slightly higher energy use in the Oregon Eastern climate zone. So we would multiply that by the ASHRAE ratio of 1.13, and that gives us a Northwest equivalent EUI. The reason for that difference is primarily driven by climate. The climate in San Antonio is a little bit more temperate year-round than it is in Oregon. Maybe a slightly hotter summer, but overall warmer through the wintertime, and that's where that difference comes from. Let's move on. So here we have a chart that shows the EUIs calculated from two different data sets. I have different clusters of general building categories highlighted in blue and orange boxes. The gray bars are the CBSA, so that's the Commercial Building Stock Assessment Northwest data set. And then CBEX, that's the Commercial Building Energy Consumption Survey national data set. So both of those are shown side by side. We can see that many of these actually have a lot of similarity. That some of these have good matches between them, and then some are quite different. I draw your attention to restaurant, cafeteria, for example, being very different. Other service also being very different. We have to take all of this into account and decide, what's a better representation for the region and for Oregon as we go through the data. All right. So our process to develop the Northwest average EUIs. So first we have to determine the error range for both data sets. So there's a bunch of statistics behind that, but generally, you look at the range of data and you perform some analysis with root mean squared error and so on, and that gives you a standard error here. So you could think of this perhaps like a percent. This is showing how much of that, if we were to guess what the actual mean is, it's probably falling somewhere within that range. So based on how big the bar is, a smaller bar is a little bit better. A bigger bar could be okay as long as it's within a certain boundary. So we have to take that into consideration as we choose which mean is correct. So here we have a few office buildings, admin, professional, bank, and government offices. We'll note that there are no commercial building stock assessment buildings for government office, which is why there's no gray bar there. So let's take a look at that next slide. So we have to determine whether the CBSA or CBEX data is a better representation for each of these. So that involves looking at a combination of the total number of buildings. We want a minimum number to be representative. I think that number that we chose was 5. The number we chose was 5. Has to be at least 5 to be representative. And we want an error range no greater than 15%. Both of those would indicate a relatively good representation. We would also preferentially choose Northwest data. So that's the Commercial Building Stock Assessment CBSA data. That would generally be the first choice if it has a good statistical fit. You can see these green bars, the data set chosen. So there's 3 different descriptions of chosen data sets. So there's CBSA, there's Commercial Building Energy Consumption Survey Adjusted, or CBEX ADJ, and then CBEX on its own. What this means is there's basically 3 ways that this data could be diced up. We take either the regional EUI straight up, we could take the national EUI straight up, or we could take the national EUI adjusted to match the regional data a little bit better. So let's move to the next slide. So the intent here with these orange bars, you can see that, and actually I think let's focus on that middle one as opposed to the one with the arrows on it. But we can see on the left-hand side, we would have chosen CBSA directly. So that's the one in, that's the writing in the green bar on the left-hand side. If we look in the middle bars, we can see that the CBSA data was a little bit, it has a good statistical fit, like a good error bound, but it's worth noting that that particular set of buildings has less than 5 buildings available. So that error bar is actually a little bit misleading. The takeaway here is that we should probably choose the national data set for that particular building for bank and financial, but we still want it to be influenced and represented by the regional data set. So we would adjust based on the error bar and say, well, we want to make this a little bit closer. So we go to the bottom range of that error bar, which is still representative and correct of that national data set. It's just much closer to the Northwest data set. Let's move on. Okay, so we have a number of slides here going through a few types, categories of buildings. So here we have the office building EUIs. So again, CBSA, that's the Commercial Building Stock Assessment Northwest data, is in gray. The national data set is in navy blue. So that's CBEX Commercial Building Energy Consumption Survey. And then the Northwest EUI, the chosen EUI based on all of that criteria, which I described before, is in green. So for offices, we can see that we have a mix of which buildings are the most appropriate. CBSA is chosen for other office and admin professional buildings. Mixed-use offices are better represented by, mixed-use offices and banks are better represented by an adjusted data set. And since there are no commercial building stock assessment data for government offices and medical offices, we would choose the national data straight up. We'll note that some of these building types we're recommending to drop. Okay, moving on, retail. And we have a number of these, so I'll just kind of go slowly over a few points here and then we can move on. So vehicle dealerships and showrooms reasonably represented in the local data, not well represented in national data. So we would choose the local data set here. Retail stores, again, good representation locally. We would choose the Northwest data set there. Other retail, pretty big statistical spread on that one. So we would choose the adjusted national data set. Again, strip shopping mall, not a lot of strip shopping malls in the regional data set. So the adjusted national is the better choice there. And then enclosed malls, no representation in the Northwest data set. So we choose national straight up. Let's move on. In education, not great representation in the Northwest data set for colleges and universities. The national data set was what had to be used there. Preschools, daycares, well represented regionally, so that Northwest data set was chosen. Same for elementary and middle schools. Other education and high schools were better represented by an adjusted national data set. Moving on, restaurants and cafeterias, reasonable representation regionally. So we chose the Northwest data set there for restaurants and cafeterias. Not good representation for fast food or convenience stores. Those had some adjustments based on other category data. And then grocery food markets, again, represented well regionally, so those were chosen from the regional data set. Moving on, healthcare. So the regional data set had good representation for hospitals and inpatient type health buildings. So that data set was chosen. Clinics, very wide range of data from the regional data set. Not a great statistical fit, so the national data was a better choice there with a slight adjustment. And then same goes for medical office of the diagnostic type. Moving on. So developing the Northwest average EUIs. I think, yeah.
We're going to pause for some questions.
Yeah, let's pause for questions, and I think I'll hand it off shortly after this.
Awesome. So Santiago, I'm going to point you to the chat. There are some questions in there that I'm hoping we can answer in the chat. And if there are some that jump out that you think need to be answered out loud, maybe, or need some clarification, then feel free to jump in. I am going to put a link in the chat again. So we have another survey here, 2 questions this time. So again, we just want to collect your questions, collect your comments, check in and make sure that the content is clear so far, and if there's anything that we do need to clarify. And we'll also pause here and see if there's anyone who has anything really urgent that they want to have answered out loud, and then you can raise your hand to bring that question forward. So again, through the survey, you can submit comments and questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand now and we can answer.
I could address a couple of these in the chat or out loud. Kristen, what do you think would be better? Some of them I think we could quickly answer out loud.
Let's do out loud because there's no raised hands so far. So we'll go through these in the chat and then maybe we can move forward.
All right. So from Nikki, how would we imagine a prison? What building type would we imagine a prison is aligned with? According to these data sets, it would be public safety. it's that type of building. There are kind of tighter definitions in Energy Star Portfolio Manager. So, you know, we would, it would be similar to a courthouse, I think, too, or police. But yeah, that's the alignment that we would see here. Okay, moving on from Corey Fulton. How are differences in heating fuels and related impacts on EUI going to be considered? Great question, Corey. So when we're looking at the national data sets, we take the total fuel consumption of all types. You know, it is worth noting that there are different efficiencies in these fuel types when you're looking at different buildings, but ultimately we don't make any distinction. You know, if the heating fuel is, you know, all natural gas, for example, we don't make a distinction from something that's all electric. I think part of that is that we would be dicing the data sets too small if we ended up doing that, and we wouldn't get good representation within these error bars if we're trying to account for those nominal efficiencies. The surveys also don't publish the efficiencies of these heating systems, for example. So I think it ends up being a bit of a false precision if we were to break that up. Okay, moving on from Corey's question. From Nikki Burton, would data centers have their own EUI target? And if not, what would you anticipate they would be classified as? So data centers are captured within these buildings that have them. It's part of the surveys. We do note that there aren't any specific data centers that were sampled for each of these sets. I think data centers fall into a kind of a strange category of maybe pseudo-industrial, maybe producing bits and bytes of data. I think there's some finessing to be done in the rulemaking here too. We'll note that Washington excludes data centers from building types that need to be that need to have a target, but there are still requirements for buildings with data centers to meet certain criteria. So I think that's something that has to be figured out in rulemaking later. Okay, moving on. Let me know if we're running out of time, Kirsten, and I can answer the rest in the chat.
I think we'll pause it in 3 more minutes. We'll pause and then move to the chat for answering.
Okay. So from Dusty, if a designated building type changes, for example, office converted to healthcare outpatient, what will be the reporting process for the change? So this can vary depending on, you know, what the rulemaking ends up showing, and I think I'd have to lean on Blake to describe what that might look like. But in Washington, you have a compliance period, which is, I think, 1 year prior to the reporting period, where you have to figure out what your benchmarking and target is for that building. So let's say during that year you converted, there would probably be some prorating going from one to the other. If it happened outside of that 1 year period, like it happened, say, 3 years before, you would be going with the 1 year prior. So that would be whatever you change to. If the change happens afterwards, there's probably some process involved, but I think that's definitely a tough paperwork question that's maybe not my forte. Blake, would you have anything you'd like to add to that?
No, that was a good, I think that was a good overview, right? Like in those cases where a building might be like changing uses in the middle of their compliance period, that's like outside of that 1 or 2 year range right before they need to report, then that would just have to be a conversation that we would have with that particular building owner to figure out what the appropriate target is. But like Santiago mentioned, if it is a change that happens like before that compliance period that happens before you need to report, then you would just be using the building occupancy type that it is during its compliance reporting period. So
thanks, Blake. Kirsten, do we have 1 more minute?
Yeah, maybe one last question. And then
Okay.
just a heads up, Santiago, I'm going to start pulling the questions from the survey into the chat as well. And we'll just keep answering those in the chat once Poppy takes over. But 1 more minute here.
I see a couple more questions, so I'll just do one. From Linda Craig, how close are the choices for Oregon to the choices made for Washington? What factors constitute differences between Oregon and Washington. A key thing to note is that in Washington, when they developed their EUIs, the 2018 commercial building energy consumption survey had not yet been published. So they had to develop their EUIs from the 2012 survey. We would note anecdotally that theirs are probably higher as a result. Poppy will talk a little bit about that later. I'll go ahead and answer as many of these other questions as I can in the chat.
Perfect. Okay, thanks. And yeah, so we'll keep the questions going in the chat, but we'll pass it to Poppy. We want to make sure we get through all of the content for today. So over to you, Poppy.
Thank you, Kirsten, and good morning, everyone. I'm Poppy Storm with 2050 Institute. And I'm going to be talking, we can go into the next slide. I'm going to be talking more about our next step in developing the Oregon average EUIs. So what Santiago was just describing was a very important step in the process, but it was for developing 2019 Northwest average EUIs. So that's what we're calling this integration of the best available data from both the regional CBSA data set and the national CBEX data set, but we're still not considering that the final Oregon average EUIs because we do have this additional step, but they're a very important foundation for developing this next step, particularly because Oregon is about a third of the entire Northwest. And so that's about 30%. And they're also very represented in the billing data that is used for that study. The quality of the data coming from Energy Trust, for example, and Oregon Utilities is very high. So we feel very confident in that data really putting us in a closer range of the Oregon average EUIs. So for this step, we're looking at Oregon specific and other Northwest data sources to further tailor the averages specifically to the state of Oregon. Next slide. So again, this is step 3 in our process. So for this analysis, we compared the Oregon data, which is state-owned data, and Oregon schools data that we received from the state of Oregon. We also looked at Portland benchmarking data and Seattle benchmarking data for a range of years. And we compared that data against the 2019 Northwest average EUIs to explore differences and to see where there may be any reason to change something specifically for Oregon. So we literally went down line by line for every single building type and looked across all of these various data sets, all the EUIs for these various data sets to try to understand whether or not there are any significant variations that we should consider. And if not, then we recommend going with the 2019 Northwest average EUIs that Santiago just presented. So we also recommended through this analysis a few custom Oregon adjustments to specific building types. So it didn't end up being a lot of types, but it was about 3 for schools and then 1 for one other type. And I'll go into those details in a minute. But we also reviewed trends in national Northwest and Oregon EUIs to determine whether an adjustment factor may be necessary to update from older data sets. So even though for Oregon's average EUIs, we're looking at CBSA data from 2019 and CBEX data from 2018, whereas the Washington data looked at a combination of 2019 regional data plus a lot of previous data from other data sets and years, and then it was also looking at 2012 national data. So even at that time, it was already a bit old, but even now we're looking at 2019 data, but we're in 2024, and it's not going to be until 2027 until the compliance year starts for the first size cohort for Tier 1. So for this section, I'm going to present some of the results of this comparative analysis and some key considerations from the analysis, including a recommendation for a 2027 adjustment factor to reflect average EUIs during the first measurement year of the standard. So on this first slide, each of these slides that I'm going to be showing, which are somewhat similar to what Santiago showed, but we're looking at that 2019 Northwest average that was the final output of that analysis, and we're comparing that to some of these other data sources. And wherever we have a significant number of sites for those data sources, we've included them. Some of these slides have more data sets than other data sets. So each of these slides is for a specific category, and then all the subtypes within that category. And this category is for office buildings on this. So this one is for offices. The colors correspond to the data sets where EUIs were available for this category. The dark green bars are for that 2019 Northwest average EUI, and then the gray bars are for the Washington average EUIs, just so you can see where there may be some differences there, which we can see looking across those gray bars compared to the green bars, that we do show that the gray bars for Washington are a bit higher in most instances. Again, that is because the data was significantly older that was used. So we've already updated it to a certain degree to use only 2019 CBSA data for the regional data set, and then 2018 national data. So we have a Seattle EUI for the admin professional. That's in the purple bar there. And we can see that admin professional, this is pretty much the largest amount of floor area for the entire office category. And it is about 10% lower than the 2019 average. So something to note, but not something that we recommend reflecting in the Oregon average EUIs. It's just, we can see that some of these are a little higher, some are lower, but not all of them rise to the occasion of justifying a custom adjustment. We can also see that the Portland EUIs are slightly higher in this case, and these are the blue bars. And in some cases they're higher, in some cases they're lower. Next slide. So now we're going to look at retail, and again we can see that the Washington average, those gray bars, is a bit higher than the green bars, which is the 2019 Northwest average. Retail is dominated by lighting, as are a number of other subtypes and categories. So it's not surprising that we would see that when we're using newer data, we're showing lower average EUIs. So for example, that older data for the Washington average did not include nearly as many LED retrofits, which have a big impact on overall EUIs in buildings. So in this graph, we can also see that Portland in blue and Seattle in purple are all lower than the 2019 Northwest average, except for enclosed malls. But it is important to note as well that some of these data sets do not have a lot of buildings. So we didn't include those numbers here or error bounds like we did in the previous slides. But just note that particularly for some of the Seattle and Portland building types, that there aren't always a very large number because we're just looking at one city. So we also see that strip malls, for example, are quite high, but that's that large green bar over to the center right. And but this is one that, as Santiago mentioned, we actually suggest dropping since it's more of a mixed use building and likely should have a blended EUI target. Next slide. So this is for education and the education category, and this is an important one to evaluate a little bit more closely, because as you'll see, we've now added in these orange bars in addition to the Seattle and Portland benchmarking and the Washington average EUI. So the orange bars are for Oregon schools data that we received from ODO. So we are suggesting that Oregon use Oregon schools data to establish the school's average EUIs. So that's what I'm going to talk about here. So in this graph, we see that except for universities, which is on the far left, the Washington average is actually pretty close across all building types. So that gray bar is pretty close to the green Northwest average that is our starting point for the Oregon average EUIs. The Oregon schools data is about even, or in some cases lower than the Northwest average. And you can see that for elementary, middle school, for other classrooms, and for high schools. And this is one of the two instances where we suggest making a custom adjustment. And this instance applies to 3 building types, but they're all in that education category. So we suggest making a custom adjustment to the Northwest average for the school's building types. And the reasons for this are that unlike some of these other data sets like Seattle benchmarking and the Portland benchmarking, Oregon schools data set is very robust. We have more than 1,000 sites just for 3 building types. And the building types are very unambiguous. We know what is an elementary, middle school, the other classrooms, and high schools. This is not always the case when we're looking at, for example, Portland and Seattle data. Sometimes there can be a mismatch. This is self-reported data. We don't know if the building types are exactly representing the same building types that we're looking at, but for schools, we have a very large data set. It's unambiguous what the building types are, and it's highly representative of Oregon schools across the state because it's a near census sample of all schools. It's literally nearly all of the schools in the entire state. So we recommend using the elementary, middle school, other classroom education, and high school EUIs as the Oregon average EUIs for schools, and you'll see that reflected later in a composite graph that we have of all the building types. Next slide. So now we're looking at a combination of the restaurant category and the grocery category for our EUI comparison. So restaurants are another instance where we recommend a custom adjustment. So the Northwest average from the 2019 CBSA, which you can see in green on the far left, is about 425. That's the largest EUI by far that we have in for any of these building types. And what we're seeing is that that 2019 CBSA EUI is extremely high. It doesn't align with the national CBEX data for 2018, nor does it align with Portland or Seattle. So when we went through and looked at each building type line by line, we didn't see these types of extreme variations in any of the other building types. This is one particular building type where it really stood out. And so we were looking to identify anomalies like this one, and we believe that this is an instance where the CBSA estimate stands out. So we do not think that this is really representative of Oregon, the Oregon restaurant average EUI, and we recommend adjusting it slightly downward to align more with the other data sets. And I'll discuss what we selected for that or what we're recommending in future slides. And then just quickly on that last one for grocery. The grocery was pretty similar across all of them, so we feel pretty confident in using the 2019 Northwest average. Next slide. Okay, so the healthcare, this is all for the healthcare category, and the healthcare average EUIs are fairly similar across the various types. So the data set types. So if you look at hospital inpatient health, we're not looking at huge variations, although the Portland and Seattle data there in purple and blue are significantly lower than the 2019 average EUI that we're recommending in green. But these are for specific cities. It does likely represent a lot of the hospitals in the region, but we don't feel like we have a strong enough reason to make an adjustment there. So we're not recommending that we put any downward pressure on that hospital number. And then you can see with the other building types, they're either almost the same or pretty similar. The only one that stands out is this outpatient health, where we see Portland is significantly lower. But again, how many buildings did we really have in that Portland data set? And are we categorizing the building types, that this actual subtypes even below these types, are we categorizing them in the same way? So we didn't recommend any change there. Next slide. All right, so now I just wanted to summarize what we're recommending for tailoring the 2019 Northwest average EUIs that Santiago presented. So with the exception of restaurants and schools, we did not see significant differences in building type EUIs across these data sets that we felt warranted any kind of custom adjustment. So what you're seeing on that first row is relevant building type differences, question mark. So we didn't really see any relevant differences for the Oregon state owned. We did see relevant differences for Oregon schools. And then we didn't really see any for Portland benchmarking or Seattle benchmarking. Believe me, there were differences, but they weren't relevant in the sense that we felt like they rose to the need to make a custom adjustment, or that we felt justified using just those data sets to make a custom adjustment, because we're trying to be fairly conservative across the board and really root all of the recommendations in robust data sets that are the most representative of the state of Oregon. So the question on the bottom row is, should we use this for a custom adjustment? So just to confirm, we said no across all of these, but then we said yes for the Oregon schools. Next slide. So this slide is looking at how we decided to make recommendations based on trends over time. And I do have some additional data to show you on that. So we looked at trends over time across all of these data sets to determine whether an adjustment factor is warranted, to update the 2019 Northwest average to either 2024 consumption, which is the current year that we're doing the analysis, or potentially 2027 consumption, which is the first measurement year of the first cohort. So what we're seeing is, and you can see this in the first row, that EUIs are trending down over time for most of the data sets. This includes the national CBEX data and the regional CBSA data, which were conducted prior to the pandemic. So those are not even reflecting any changes having to do with the pandemic, which we don't actually think that we should be reflecting in these recommendations, because we don't know where that's going. Ideally, these buildings do become more highly used, and so we don't really want to put downward pressure just based on some pandemic numbers. So we're not really using that. But we do see in these data sets, the national and regional data sets, which were before the pandemic, we're seeing reductions in EUIs over time. So this is likely mostly due to the significant impact of LED retrofits that will continue in the future because unlike envelope improvements or other kinds of retrofits, the lighting is on a replacement schedule. And so eventually we're going to see more downward pressure on EUIs as a result of all of those LED retrofits. So we also see a downward trend in the Seattle data, which is reflected in this table. The Portland and state-owned data was not as easy to track due to variations in building type assignments, and so we just added an NA for those types. But then there's the question of what data should Oregon use to establish an adjustment factor? And so although there were larger reductions in the CBSA data and the Oregon schools data and the Seattle benchmarking data, we feel that it's more reliable and conservative in an approach that would be to use the 2012 to 2018 national CBEX data trend. So this is showing about a 10% reduction overall spread out across the 6 years between 2012 and 2018. And before we stop for questions, I just have a couple more slides to show you a little bit more about how those data sets are trending down. Next slide. So this is developing Oregon average EUIs, looking at the national EUIs for CBEX from 2012 to 2018. And so we see how the national EUIs are, pardon me, going down over time. And again, this does not account for 2018 up until now or 2018 to 2027. But we can see that in almost all cases, there is a downward trend in EUIs. And in some cases, the trend is actually around 12%, 13, 14, up to 16%. But the average across all the building types is 10%. Next slide. So here's similar data for the regional CBSA data sets. And this is showing 2014 in green to 2019 in blue. So as you can see going down, these are, and both of these, they're rolled up to these larger categories. It's not looking at all of the individual building types. But we see a downward trend in all but a couple types in the CBSA regional data as well. And the CBSA report sees these adjustments in the narrative in the report. It sees these adjustments in those two building types that did not go down as adjustments to the previous samples and being more representative of those types and the type of buildings that would be categorized under those overarching categories. Next slide. So just to summarize, we're recommending applying 4 custom adjustments and applying a universal adjustment factor to establish Oregon average EUIs. So for the custom adjustments, it's the schools and restaurants. And for restaurants, it would be an EUI adjustment downward of about 23% to align more with the other data sets. And that reflects about half of the difference between the 2019 CBSA number of about 425 and the CBEX number, which is actually around 225. And we see that the Portland and Seattle is even lower than that. So we're not recommending to use the CBEX data, but like Santiago was showing, where we make an adjustment kind of somewhere in between, we're looking at about a 23% adjustment. And then for the universal adjustment factor, we recommend using that 10% reduction in the CBEX national data, which averages out to about 1.7% per year. And the reason why we're recommending that CBEX data is that it's a very large population of buildings. It's more than 6,000 sites, and we are doing adjustments for climate when we're using it in our 2019 Northwest averages. And it's a representative sample. It's highly vetted data and analysis. It's not self-reported. It's highly vetted by an analyst team, and it's a fairly conservative estimate that's calculated pre-COVID. Next slide. So finally, here are some considerations in determining whether or not the recommendation should be 2024, which is the current year for analysis, versus 2027, which is the benchmark year for the first year of the measurement. That's a June 1st, 2028 reporting deadline, but that's based on data from the previous year, which is 2027. So we suggest calculating it as 1.7% per year. That would be about a reduction of 8.5% total across all building types for 2024. That's bringing it up 5 years from 2019 to the present year. Or it would be a reduction of about 13.6% if we bring it up 8 full years between 2019 and 2027. And then we apply that factor to the 2019 Northwest average EUIs to reflect either that 2024 or 2027 average EUIs. Next slide. So I'm not going to go over all of these numbers, but this is a pretty nice graphic that shows descending from the highest EUIs down to the lowest EUIs by building type. It shows the EUIs with the adjustment factor for 2024 in gray and the adjustment factor in 2027 in the dark green. And so as you can see, it's not actually a huge difference between those two going across all of the building types, but there is a difference. And we've also indicated in this graph, and this is just for future reference when you're reviewing the slides, that on the top, we indicated the 4 places where we calibrated the EUIs. So that's restaurants on the far left, and then we also have the 3 schools on the far right. So that's all that I'm going to present on the Oregon adjustments for the average EUIs, but now we're going to go into a few questions and then talk about the targets, how we go from averages to targets.
Thanks, Poppy. We are quite tight on time and a little bit behind in our timing right now. So for this pause, I'm just going to put the survey in the chat. The survey for this one also includes some additional questions that we want to hear your feedback on. So things like, how do you feel about the proposed EUIs, and do these EUIs align with or differ from your policy expectations? So we'd love to hear some comments. There are great questions in the chat, and I know we haven't been able to answer every single one of those yet. So anything that is missed, we are going to answer that offline, and we'll pull out all of these questions and answers and put them in a more readable format for you, because I know there's a lot going on in the chat. But and will you be answering questions from the survey here, or do you need them in the chat? So if you put it in the chat, we'll try to answer it in the chat. If you put it in the survey, I'll try to pull it into the chat, but not every question is going to be answered live during the meeting. So either way, if you put it in either the chat or the survey, we'll make sure that it gets answered at some point, either in the meeting now, or if we need to, we'll push some questions offline. So either place is totally fine to put your questions and they'll be answered. But yeah, just to keep us moving through our content and to keep us on time. So the survey is the place to put in your questions for this pause, and we'll keep going through the content. Poppy, I believe we're back to you.
All right. Well, hopefully we can catch up a little bit on time, and we'll have plenty of time to go over some of the questions at the end. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit, moving from the average EUIs for Oregon, which would either be the 2024 or 2027 adjustment. And now we're going to look at how do we shift from those average EUIs to thinking about target EUIs. So we're going to go over the process and a little bit of the target setting criteria, look at some EUI target comparisons, and then also discuss some key considerations. Next slide. So the first step in thinking about the targets is assessing the average EUIs against a set of target setting criteria. Then there's a process of discussing the implications, considering a rationale for any kind of changes, and then finalizing the targets. So just a quick recap, the average EUIs are the highest EUI target that can be set. So there can be no lower EUR target set than that average EUI. And that's why the average EUI is so important for the basis for determining the targets. Next slide. So the process for establishing target setting criteria was multifold. The first one was considering key drivers. What is this law actually trying to achieve in relation to the overall climate and energy objectives of Oregon state policy? And then looking at the specific directives of House Bill 3409, as well as some input from the Rulemaking Advisory Committee. And all of this was put together to develop the target setting criteria. Next slide. So here's a snapshot of the target setting criteria. And honestly, almost all of the criteria are taken directly from the bill, because the bill was actually very specific in what was required for the targets. So just to recap those quickly, it must be weather normalized and net energy, which is what we're doing in the average EUIs and what we would be setting for the targets. The targets must be equal to or greater than the average EUIs. We've just spent a lot of time going over the process for developing and establishing those average EUIs, and now our targets can be no greater than those EUIs. We also need to include 2 or more climate zones, which we will be doing for the targets. Those aren't represented specifically in the data here, but they definitely would be established for the final targets. And then there's also adjusting as necessary for unique energy using features. That's not so much involved in the averages and these targets, because mostly any kind of standard but seemingly unique energy using features for various building types are already assumed within the context of these averages, since it's across all of the buildings. But there may be in the rulemaking a need for having some exceptions or exclusions for particularly unique energy using features, like, for example, a particle accelerator at a university or something like that at a hospital. So we also are expected to consider regional and local building energy use, which we've done and showed you all of the various data sets that we were considering. We must exclude EV supply equipment, so electric vehicle charging cannot be included in the energy use. And then it's also explicit in the House bill that they must maximize GHG reductions. And then an additional criteria that was added by the RAC is to recognize flexible loads. And we noted here that we see that as somewhat EUI target adjacent, since it's not something that we would necessarily include in the target, but it's something that may be included in the rulemaking. For example, there could be some exceptions or adjustments made for different types of load configurations. Or perhaps at this point in the process, it's more something that utilities might want to look at for incentivizing some programs that are building off of the building performance standard. Next slide. So what ODO is recommending here in this first step is to start out using the Oregon average EUIs as the targets. And so the question here would be whether or not those average EUIs would be for 2024 adjusted average EUIs or for 2027 adjusted average EUIs. And I just have one slide here to show the comparison of some of those targets. This has actually a number of groups of categories. So you can see offices, you can see, actually, this is all for offices. Sorry, I thought that we had some other categories, but we have so many types and specific variations on the energy use intensity targets that it's across just offices. So if you want to look at this in more detail, you can see that the gray bars are 2024, the green bars are 2027. But then we also have some other examples. For example, the Washington energy use target for the existing buildings as well as for newer buildings. And for KICS, we also included the ASHRAE 100 2024 targets in this dark brown, which are actually significantly lower than most of the other targets. And for your reference, we've included in the appendix of this slide deck, we've included a more detailed table of all the recommended targets so you can see those specifically. So I'm going to leave things there on the targets. We've outlined some of the key considerations, and now we're going to move on back to Kirsten to have a discussion.
Awesome. And everyone knows the drill now. We've got a survey to get some feedback and take your questions. And we do have about 10 minutes now where we can answer some of those questions that may have been missed or that we haven't had a chance to call out yet. So Poppy, I will highlight some of these that have come in that maybe we haven't had a chance to answer yet. And if other questions come in through the survey, of course, we can answer those as well. So this question has come in a couple of times, so I want to make sure the asker knows that it's been answered. So where does manufacturing and/or industrial fall, and is it included in one of the definitions? Blake has answered this in the chat and explained that when the primary use greater than 50% is manufacturing or industrial use, the building would be eligible for an exemption. So that one there has been answered. There is a question in the Q&A. I see a lot of variability in EUI declines. Seems like a more custom adjustment factors are in order for hospitals in particular. Is this possible?
I guess I would say that it's definitely possible, and thank you for the comment and question on that, and we'll take that into consideration when we review the EUI targets.
Awesome. Another question here. So someone's asking if a line can be added to the graphs to show the number of buildings included in each data set. And then a secondary question, is it possible to combine both data sets, so CBSA and CBEX, instead of choosing one or the other? And then is it just because the data is too disparate? Like why not combine the data sets?
I think that I'd maybe hand that over to Santiago.
I was hoping you would answer that, Poppy.
Okay.
Well, so I think the number one thing to consider on why not just combine the data sets are that they're collected a little bit differently. You know, in an ideal world, they would have the exact same methods for collecting data, and that's part of why we preferentially choose CBSA, is we think it's actually a more robust method of collecting data, which is why we like to lean on it whenever it's possible. You know, I think we could consider it, you know, something like, well, I don't want to use something so trite as apples and oranges. It's not really like that, but you know, the building data from CBSA is pretty high quality. CBEX data is also very high quality, but it's, you know, just collected a little bit differently, and it's nationally organized. So you know, whenever we combine those data sets, because of the volume of CBEX, we would lose a lot of CBSA data in the noise. So I think that's why, is we don't want to provide too much weight to the national data set.
Perfect, thank you. Another question here from Joe that I think might be a little bit more forward thinking than what we're talking about today, but just to put it out there. So there's a lot of discussion about the amount of energy that AI will be using in the coming years and decades. As buildings add AI capability to their data centers, how can we account for this when looking at future 2027 and beyond energy consumption?
I can speak to this a little bit. AI is not my specialty, but from what I've discussed with people who do run AI operations and who run data centers, The type of data center needed for AI computations is a pretty high performance system. This is the type of thing that you would preferentially put inside of a dedicated data center building. You could certainly operate these types of data centers in the more kind of edge computing mode. So that's data that's located closer to where it's used. So we have some of those types of buildings that exist in the Northwest and the more urban areas. But the edge computing needs don't yet outweigh the standard style of data. That could change, of course, and the technology could change. But as of right now, data centers for AI tend to be located in dedicated systems. That's, of course, for right now. That could change in the future.
Awesome. And I believe the last question we have is from the survey. How were the ASHRAE 100 targets determined?
I could take this one. ASHRAE 100 targets were determined from median energy use intensities for buildings. So we take means. So I mean, these are both forms of averages, but median would be you stack up all of the data in sorted order of size, and then the middle data point. If it's 10 data points, it would be data point number 5 or number 6, which would be your median. Some methods would say you take the difference between those two, and then mean is where you add up all of them and then divide by the number of data points. So ASHRAE 100 was developed using that method, and I think they actually didn't even take the exact median value. They might have taken something closer towards a lower quartile of those values. So that's a broad strokes difference.
Awesome. And I think we're caught up at this point on all the questions and comments we've received. I see a hand here from Brad. Just before we go to you, Brad, I just want to let folks know we're seeing some awesome comments and commentary and discussion in the chat. The comment period will open in October, and that's when we want to make sure all these comments are coming in. So it's awesome to hear it today, and we also want to make sure we hear that during the comment period when that does open. But Brad, I will pass it over to you, and you can unmute and ask your question. Brad, I don't know if you need any technical support here to be able to unmute.
Someone needs to unmute Brad, and I don't know if I have the capability. There you go.
Thanks all. Morning. I had a question about sort of when the mean or the EUI target will be kind of next calculated. Is Odo planning to allow non-compliant buildings to be considered part of the average and thus kind of affect the EUI target? Or would a non-compliant building sort of not be part of the next calculation of the average?
Yeah, this is Blake Shalide with the Oregon Department of Energy. I can kind of address that. I think so. The next time that we update our performance standard, including EUI targets, will be in 5 years, in 2029. I don't know that I've got a great, complete answer about whether or not it would include non-compliant buildings in that average. I think that'll be something that we'll be really interested in as that next phase, next compliance period, and kind of a recalibration of the averages and the targets happens. But it's definitely something that we would be looking for input on when that time comes in a few years and we recalculate the averages. Thanks.
Perfect. Okay. And seeing some different comments coming in on the methodology for calculating the EUIs, so we'll be considering that. And then other comments and discussion on kind of the further down the line questions about things like reporting, or some of that will come up in our rulemaking comment period. So I really appreciate everyone's commentary today and the thoughtful questions and engaging with some pretty heavy content. That's been great. I think we've answered everything. Again, we'll summarize the Q&A and make sure that if you did ask a question and maybe it got lost in the chat, you'll be able to see that pulled out clearly so you know the answer that we can provide. I see one more question here from Jenna. We'll answer that, and then after that, we'll pass it to Anna for our wrap up and next steps. So Jenna, your question was in Portfolio Manager, is Net EUI site or source EUI? Not sure if our team has that one.
Yeah, it's site EUI.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you. So pass it to Anna. We'll wrap up and do our next steps, and then pass it to Blake to close out the meeting.
Great. So you've had a lot of content. It's been an hour and a half of conversation through the very beginning of what is a building performance standard, what is an EUI, then going through the means, the averages, then going through the targets. And so as you're thinking throughout the next month before those final targets get released and the public comment period opens up, we want you to walk away from this call having had your sneak peek with a couple of takeaways. One is just being able to think about that process, you know, from the very beginning of which data sets come in, how we make decisions between what data set, the rigor at which we look at every single building type to try to identify the extent to which custom adjustments may need to be made. We also want you to take away that kind of concept when we were looking at those Washington EUIs compared to the EUIs that we have here, and taking into account that from the 2012 data set that was used for the Washington EUIs, those EUIs are trending down, which means that targets will not look the same as they look in other places for rulemakings that were conducted at previous times. We also want to recognize the energy efficient landscape that we have up here in the Pacific Northwest and in Oregon, and recognize that it is just a fact that we are more efficient here than the national averages on average. And so many of those building types are still going to be lower than those national data sets. And, you know, that we have some recommendations that will change from what you see here to what gets released at the end of the month, where we're going to look at those custom adjustments and provide what those recommendations are. And then also that concept of doing a forward-looking adjustment so that we're looking at the 2027 average rather than just looking at an average that will be representative of today, but using data sets from, you know, by the time compliance happens, that will be 8 years old. So those are kind of our key takeaways. I'm going to take you through the next steps. We are going to adjust those averages. We are going to present those final averages to Odo as the recommendation. Odo will file the draft targets, and then the public comment period will begin. Again, final rules will happen at the end of the year. One thing to keep in mind, you can access this slide deck, and we're not going to go into the slides, but we do have tables after this that have the draft targets in them numerically by building type and ASHRAE building type. So you can go take a look at those in detail at your leisure. Otherwise, I'm going to hand it off to Blake. You still have half an hour of content for this meeting. And I want to thank our team. Thank you for coming, for listening, for your questions, for your attentiveness. And yeah, thank you very much. And Blake, it's your show.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Thanks, Santiago. Thanks, Poppy, for the overview of the energy target setting process. Now I'm going to just give a brief overview of kind of where we've been this year with regard to the rest of the rulemaking associated with building performance standards, and provide a little bit of input or rather overview opportunity for what's coming next through the end of the year, to make sure that folks kind of understand where the key opportunities are for input, and where we're going from now until where we need to be in filing our draft rules by the end of the year. So I'm just going to share a few slides, and I think we'll probably still have a few minutes for discussion and questions at the end. I don't have that much material, so if there are some questions, feel free to hold those to the end, and I think we'll probably have a little bit of time too. So where we've been this year, the 2024 rulemaking process has involved multiple meetings of our rulemaking advisory committee. We've met 7 times with the RAC, moving through each section of the ASHRAE Standard 100 2024 building performance standard language, looking at Oregon modifications. If anyone's interested, those meetings are all recorded and up on our rulemaking website. We've had a couple public meetings over the course of the year as well to roll up and consolidate the RAC activity to provide an early look, an early preview of the work that's been done. And that's one of the functions of today's meeting too. We've posted the drafts in their current state up on our website for review. And as was mentioned earlier, so we've got till the end of the month, we'll be kind of finalizing, taking comments for our draft rules, and then we'll publish and file those with our Secretary of State by the end of September. And they'll be open for public comment during the month of October and then the first part of November. And then we'll hold a rulemaking hearing in mid-November as kind of the main opportunity to provide comments and input, verbal comments and input on our draft rules, with the opportunity during the public comment period to provide written comments as well. And then that's all leading toward a final rulemaking filing date of by the end of the year. So just another depiction of what the timeline looks like. So here we are today in September 11th public meeting. We reviewed the methodology for setting the energy use targets. We'll be taking feedback between now and the end of the month where we file our draft rules. To the extent that we're able to make revisions of these draft rules as we're compiling and cleaning them up, we can certainly do that between now and the end of the month. But also know that if you submit comments now, or if you submit comments during the open public comment period, those are comments that we'll take into account and we'll consider for potential revisions to the draft rules. We do envision potentially having a public meeting to help with our stakeholders to support the review process during October. So if there are questions as stakeholders are reviewing the rules, if they have any clarifying questions or just need a little bit of a high-level guidance for the various sections of the rules, just because it is a pretty broad rule set, because the ASHRAE Standard 100 document is hundreds of pages in and of itself. So we will likely hold some kind of a public meeting, rulemaking advisory committee meeting that's open to the public in October to help answer those questions. So keep an eye out for that. But the formal public review and comment period will be that month of October into November. So what's up now on the website for early kind of preliminary draft review to give folks an early look for what our draft rules might look like that we file for review by the end of the month is the ASHRAE Standard 100 with Oregon modifications, chapters 1 through 9, and those are the chapters that we worked through with the RAC. In addition to the investment criteria pathway appendix, and then the 2 appendices for Tier 1 covered buildings reporting requirements, and then Tier 2 covered buildings reporting requirements. And then we've also had a lot of discussion with the RAC and some focused discussion with utilities and the public around utility data aggregation. So we've drafted some potential language for utility data aggregation that's up on our website, and we are definitely looking for input and looking for feedback on that. There are, in addition to the draft versions of the rules that are redlined and marked up, there are comment portals up on the website too that provide a written opportunity for folks to make their comments. And just to give a brief overview of what's in each of those draft rules that are up now. So kind of the work that we've done with the RAC since the last public meeting. This is an opportunity to kind of consolidate some of that. Is ASHRAE Standard 100, the chapter 7 covers the energy use and greenhouse gas emissions analysis target requirements. And that's really the process for determining the EUI targets, particularly for buildings with mixed uses, how you determine that weighted average if you have a building that has multiple types of uses. The modifications to that chapter also include removal of language that references the greenhouse gas intensity targets. ASHRAE Standard 100 itself has a lot of language around both energy targets and greenhouse gas targets, because our statewide BPS is based on site energy use intensity. We've modified the standard to take that into account. Chapter 8 of the standard outlines the energy audit process with decarbonization assessment. When an audit is required for BPS compliance, say for example, a building doesn't meet their EUI target, or if they're following the investment criteria pathway and they need to do an audit, to identify a bundle of optimized cost-effective measures. And then Chapter 9 outlines the process for implementing the standard, the implementation and verification requirements. The investment criteria pathway in that language, that appendices, is modeled after Washington State's pathway, and it provides a pathway for compliance if a building doesn't meet their energy use intensity target, but instead is able to invest in a bundle of cost-effective measures to reduce their energy usage. And it's, like I mentioned, largely modeled after the Washington State pathway as well. And then we've also drafted language to propose a potential requirement for utility data aggregation. And as drafted, the language would require larger qualified utilities equal to or greater than 3% of retail sales, and that matches the thresholds for other Oregon State programs, in particular the renewable portfolio standard. So that's what it would mean to be a larger qualified utility, to provide that aggregated data for upload into Energy Star Portfolio Manager. So those are the proposed language around that utility data aggregation, and we expect that there'll be some good discussion and good feedback on that. And then lastly, the appendices for both Tier 1 covered building reporting requirements and Tier 2 covered building reporting requirements. The draft language is up on the website and included there. For Tier 1 buildings, it's modeled really closely after Washington State's appendix, and it provides that reporting process and requirements for those Tier 1 buildings, including things like the building and energy information that's required to be reported in the forms that are associated with that. And then for Tier 2 buildings are only required to benchmark their energy usage. So that language is summarized in the reporting requirements there. And I'll just point out that the Oregon process is not proposed to require things like energy management plans and operations and management plans for those Tier 2 buildings. So if you're familiar with how how the Washington process works, Tier 2 buildings are required to develop energy management plans, operations management plans, but the proposed language in Oregon would just require the energy benchmarking through Portfolio Manager. And that covers my overview of the draft rules that are up for preliminary review, but just know that we'll be taking comments on those, revising those toward ultimately what's filed with our Secretary of State by the end of the month. And then there'll be the larger formal public opportunity for rule review and rule comment coming in October and in the fall. So
Blake, there's some questions that maybe you could clarify. There is a question on when the portal will open for final chapters. Is there a specific date?
Yeah, for portal comments, the portal comments are up right now. They're open. They're up on the website. You're certainly able to make any comments that you have at this point for the draft rules, and it'll end up being the exact same portals. We'll just leave the same portals open. And if you go on the website, the portals are separated out by topic. So there's a separate topic or a separate portal for comments for chapters 1 through 3 of the standard, chapters 4 through 6, chapters 7 through 9, and then individual portals for comment on each of the appendix sections as well.
Great. And then the other question is, when will there be access to this presentation and draft average? Is that available now?
Yes, so there is the presentation up on the website right now, and I'm going to be adding these slides I just presented to the website too, but the entire presentation that the SBW team, including the table of draft averages, is already up on the website.
Great. There are a couple of other questions. I think we have time to answer them, right?
Mm-hmm.
There is a question about meter aggregation process. How is the meter aggregation process treated?
So I think I understand the question. So the draft rules would require those larger utilities that meet the qualified utility definition to, upon request from a building owner. So this situation covers scenarios where a building might have multiple utility meters that are paid for or under the control of individual tenants, and the building owner that's tasked with complying with the building performance standard might not have direct access to each of those individual utility meters. So what these rules would do is they would allow that building owner to work with their utility to obtain aggregated energy usage. So no personally identifiable, like meter specific energy usage, but rolled up aggregated usage for their whole building to be able to report and to be able to determine compliance and whether or not they meet the energy use intensity target. So it would require those utilities to provide the data, the aggregated data, and work with the owner to identify all the meters that are attached to the building, and then provide that aggregated data to the building owner for reporting.
And a relatively similar or a connected question on whether what it's meant by utility aggregated data associated with Energy Star Portfolio Manager.
So this is where a building owner, and I think I understand the question here too, but Kevin, if I don't hit the mark there, please let me know. So this would be in a situation where like a building owner needs to report their electricity usage and there's multiple meters, that they need to report their electricity usage for the whole building, like into Portfolio Manager. And I know Portfolio Manager does have the capability to include individual meters in there as well. But this would be a building owner reporting just like one aggregated number into Portfolio Manager for the whole building, like the aggregated meter number, where they don't have access to individual meters.
Kevin, does that answer your question? Please put it in the chat.
And if we need to have some offline conversation, happy to have that too.
Right. There is a question about building targets and how it's determined when you have a centralized heating and cooling plant, like a college campus.
Yeah, good question. So we are aware and we've reviewed and are planning to incorporate. I know Washington has recently published an update to their standard that covers applications for district energy systems, like you might see on a college campus, or like you might see in some more urban areas have district energy systems as well. So we are planning to incorporate that allowance for district energy systems that Washington's recently treated too, but the individual building targets would still be based on their occupancy types. But then the application for the district energy system and the decarbonization plan, similar to the way that Washington's treated it, will be incorporated into the Oregon process as well.
So Kevin mentions that maybe clarifying the question a little bit more of will utilities be required to upload directly into Portfolio Manager in any case?
The draft rules right now just require the utilities to provide the data to the building owner in a spreadsheet format that's capable for uploading into Portfolio Manager, but would not require that direct connection and automatic connection with Portfolio Manager.
One other question about Tier 1. Kevin is asking whether Tier 1 includes requirements for energy management plans and O&M plans.
For Tier 1 buildings, yes, those are required.
Okay, and then I think, yeah, the questions are coming in. It's great. We still have time, right, Blake?
We do. Yeah, I think we've got 13 minutes or so.
All right, so I think we're getting some general comments coming in, which is great. Sounds like building owners will be required to report via Portfolio Manager. Is that correct? Maybe just clarifying that one more time. That it is, right?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Sounds like building owners will be required to report via Portfolio Manager. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. I think we've answered all the questions, unless I missed
see a question
one.
about will there be BPS accelerators like in Washington?
Yes,
That is definitely something that we're starting and have been actually having some conversations with our utilities to figure out the best ways that Oregon utilities can help support and accelerate building owner compliance. We're definitely interested in providing that support network to help building owners comply with the standards.
Perfect. And a follow-up question that's related to utilities on whether if they don't provide electronic data currently, will there be an effort to get them to provide aggregate data electronically?
So yes, good question. And that is the kind of general heart of that requirement for the larger utilities to provide the aggregated data. We've spoken with a number of utilities and do understand that in some cases there are resource limitations and potential technology system limitations, particularly on the part of some of our smaller utilities in Oregon with aggregating that data and providing it, which is why we've initially proposed our rules to have separate requirements for the larger utilities versus the smaller utilities, and certainly look to look to how that works, and how that's actually implemented in the state, and definitely open for additional discussion on that.
I think, yeah, go ahead.
There are just a couple of questions also from the survey since we have the time
Yeah.
that I would love to bring forward. The first one is going to be more for Poppy or Santiago, so I just want to make sure that you two are dialed in and listening to this one. So the question is, how does the 2023 Portland and Seattle benchmarking data compare to that 1.7% per year reduction trend that you were seeing? So you saw that 1.7% per year reduction as a trend. Were you also seeing that in Portland and Seattle? And are you seeing that post-COVID vacancy is affecting this? Poppy or Santiago, are you available to answer that one?
I'm available. So for the first question, we definitely saw those reductions on the Seattle side. We saw them, it was a little bit more plus and minus on the Portland side, but we also have some concerns in the Portland data with alignment regarding the building types. So that was a consideration there. And then what was the second question?
How does post-COVID vacancy affect this?
Well, what we've seen is that we do also think that there are reductions. If you look just at the most recent kind of pre-COVID to post-COVID, it's hard to disaggregate what is causing that. Is a lot of this just natural reductions due to a trending downward with LEDs and other types of like really kind of game-changing technology changes that every building is going to be implementing because it's the national standard for lighting now. But disaggregating that from what might be a COVID impact is pretty difficult. So that's partly why we're not recommending using those differences that relate only to data sets that are pre and post COVID. And that's the Seattle and the Portland data sets. So the CBSA regional and the CBEX national data are actually pre-COVID. So just kind of making that distinction there. And to summarize, we're not recommending making adjustments based on post-pandemic energy use, precisely because we don't know if that's going to be sustained over time. So we wouldn't want to kind of codify that within the EUI targets. So we're really looking at much more conservative and general trending down over time.
Awesome, thank you. I have just two more questions from the survey. So how and when do each of the 2024 and 2027 Oregon average EUIs apply?
Did you say how and when do they apply?
Yeah.
So those would be applied if you take the 2019 Northwest average EUIs, which is that final output of what Santiago described of kind of integrating the best of the regional and national data. Once you get that 2019 Northwest average EUI, we would apply either the 2024 adjustment factor or the 2027 adjustment factor to those averages. And then we would have the final Oregon average EUI, in addition to those other custom adjustments. But that would still be at the point of just the average EUIs. And then the question would be, which EUIs are used for the target. And right now the recommendation is whatever that average EUI ends up being for Oregon, that would be what the target would be.
Great, thanks, Poppy. And then the last question that I have from the survey is, I believe that the EUI targets had a floor of the EUI average. Once the data set analysis is complete, will the EUI development, like will the EUIT have a target of having a certain percentile of buildings that meet the EUIT without any additional actions? So for example, setting the targets so that 25% of buildings already meet their EUIT. Is that going to be a component or a consideration?
That won't be a consideration at this point in the BPS, in the standard process, and that's mainly because we don't have that information on the buildings that need to comply. So there may be more information like that available for the next cycle because the benchmarking will already be in place, but currently we don't have that benchmarking data for the actual buildings that are going to be subject to the law.
Awesome. Thank you.
Lots of good comments are coming in the chat also. I think there is one last potential question. I'm not going to go through comments, but a question about data integrity. If the data doesn't come directly from utilities, how would you essentially kind of make sure the data is not been meddled with? Should it be certified? I guess it's a common question combined, but like.
So there are requirements for the personnel that, like the energy managers and the qualified persons that are in charge of gathering the data and reporting the data. So having some of those qualifications, I think, will help to increase the robustness and the quality of the data that is reported. In addition to Energy Star Portfolio Manager does have some data quality checks and data verification processes that are part of the reporting process as well to help with that. But those are just some ways I think that we can help ensure data quality.
Wonderful. And Ilana wants to just clarify if ODO is targeting the average EUI from the data set as the EUI target. So is the EUI target from the average?
Yes. Yes, those are the proposed, those will be the proposed targets, will be the average EUIs.
Okay, one last question. I think it's a question. I wonder how long it will take for the minimally compliant buildings. Yeah, I think that was, I looked at it more as a comment, but let's read it out. I wonder how long it will take for minimally compliant buildings built under current codes to fall behind the BPS target and require improvement. This would be a valuable point of information to share.
So the current Oregon code is already very efficient, and Oregon will be adopting kind of the next version of ASHRAE 90.1 as its code, the 2022 version with some Oregon amendments very soon. I think likely starting at some point next year. So a new building built in Oregon is already built in one of the most efficient codes in the country. So we would expect that in most cases that building would comply with the BPS. There could be some situations where there might be some operational requirements in order to get the building to comply, where maybe if a building's operated a certain way, then it could make improvements to be able to get under the threshold. But there would always be that investment criteria pathway that's available to a building as well, if it doesn't meet, even a new building, if it doesn't meet the EUI target. But I would expect that in most cases a new very efficient building built to a current Oregon code would and should meet the energy targets.
I think that's the end of the questions we have in the chat. Like I said, lots of good comments that we will definitely capture. Kristen, are you seeing anything else in the surveys that we should address? Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, and I'll pass it to Blake for closing.
Yeah, I'd say just thanks again, everybody on the team that presented today, and for everybody that attended today with all the great comments and questions. Definitely helps us inform our rulemaking process. And again, keep an eye out for the draft rules that are published and open for comment by the end of the month as part of the formal public comment process. And definitely look forward to engaging with everybody here again in future meetings. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.